I remember very clearly I kept having this reoccurring dream. It wasn't a nightmare, and it wasn't necessarily scary, but it was unsettling. It was like I was in Huitzilopochtli, but it had changed significantly. It was very much like neighborhoods that I had experienced as a child growing up in the States. There were neatly appointed houses with yards and driveways and garages and strangers inside. But inside, they were empty or messy. So there was like piles of clothes or piles of papers or household items. And no matter what I could do in this dream, it was always like that.
That's Stephanie Poole. She works on Indigenous land claims in Huitzilopochtli, and you heard her in episode 6. She's a survivor of what's known as the 60s scoop. It was this decades-long process where tens of thousands of Indigenous kids were taken by child welfare without community consent and placed in non-Indigenous families. As a little girl, Stephanie was removed from her home in the north and transported to California.
I wasn't sure if I was just had a trigger from my youth or something. Or was this some kind of like a message or a warning about what could happen to us if we weren't careful?
The idea of a house with a mint green lawn and a white picket fence might fill you with a sense of peace. But I can understand why Stephanie wouldn't want to see Huitzilopochtli transformed into a suburb. It's a sign of what could happen if the forces of colonization are left unchallenged. Stephanie's dream felt weirdly familiar, like any of us could have dreamt it. It's been a few weeks since I finished working on Operation Morning Light, but I haven't stopped thinking about the story. Actually, it's more like the story hasn't stopped thinking about me. There's a coffee shop in Yellowknife called Birchwood that's basically been my unofficial office for a couple of years. These days, almost everyone who stops by my desk wants to talk about the satellite. But Kosmos is just the starting point for conversations that veer into the deeper, more urgent questions that the Dene are grappling with right now, like the ongoing struggle over our land and where it goes from here. A podcast series isn't going to solve these questions, but I wanted to end in a way that continues the conversation. So for this last episode, I spoke with 3 people I really admire: Stephanie Poole, Daniel Turcan, and Paul Andrew. They each offer a different generational perspective on a story of our people that began way before Kosmos 954, and some predictions on how it might turn out. I'm Dëneze Nakehk'o. From Imperative Entertainment and Vespucci, this is Operation Morning Light. Bonus episode, Daydreaming. If the name Daniel Turcan sounds familiar, it might be because you heard his uncle, Frank Turcan, in episode 5, giving that fiery speech against the Mackenzie Valley pipeline before the Berger inquiry.
We no longer intend to allow our land and our future to be taken away from us, and that we are destroyed to make someone else rich. There will be no pipeline because we, the Dene people, are awakening to see the truth of the system of genocide that has been imposed on us, and we will not go back to sleep.
That fire has been passed down to Daniel. He's about my age, in his 40s, and he lives in Fort Good Hope, a Saulteaux Dene community on the Big River. Daniel trained as a lawyer, but he kind of hated it, so he started consulting around issues of self-government, Indigenous rights, and environmental justice. He just got back from Egypt when I called him up. He was there for the UN Climate Change Conference, where he brought the message that Indigenous people need to be central to the climate fight. Before we started talking about the future, I asked Daniel to take me back to the past.
The first contact was late 1700s, and in the period of about a century following that, the kind of prime economic driver on Canada's part for interacting with our people was the fur trade. So they made a lot of money off the fur trade. Like, a lot of people in the South and places like Montreal got rich off of that fur trade. The motivation was always economic, but it was economically beneficial for them at that point for Dené to be on the land and practicing our culture and trapping, because they made money off of that. The situation started to shift more around 1900, when there was obviously a gold rush happening over the mountains in what's now Yukon. But also the Geological Survey of Canada had discovered just massive hydrocarbon reserves. So that includes the tar sands area in northern Alberta, the bitumen there. And then there's other deposits of gas and oil as far north as like Norman Wells, right? At that point, us being on the land as Dené was an obstruction to them making money. And so there was kind of a shift in colonial policy of them effectively wanting to colonize our people, get us off the land, get us living in communities, in housing units, participating in the wage economy, and severing that connection that our people have with the land so that they could exploit it for profit. But there was also this push then to secure their legal title, as they call it, to all of our land. And that was really the impetus for Treaty 8 in 1899 and Treaty 11 in 1921 on the part of the government of Canada.
And this brings me to Paul Andrew. When I first started working on Operation Morning Light, I knew that Paul had to be involved. He's 71 years old, was born in the Mackenzie Mountains, immersed in Dene traditions. Then he was sent to residential school for 7 years. Since then, he's been the chief of Toledo, vice president of the Dene Nation, and he's worked for the CBC for almost 3 decades. Whenever I need to know something fundamental about Dene history, Paul's the man. I asked him to explain a bit about the treaties Daniel mentioned.
This is a treaty between two sovereign nations. So in 1921, when the treaty was signed, the British Crown recognized the Indigenous people as a sovereign nation. So this is not just a piece of paper. There's a term that as long as the sun shines, the grass grows, and the river flows, nothing in the treaty will change. The significance of that, for me, is paramount. You have to remember again in 1921, the relationship that the Dene had with the land, the water, and the sun. The sun basically is the mother of Earth. So it's one of the most important natural elements that the Dene, and they know that. And the same thing with the water. They have always said that without water, there's no life. And the same thing with natural growth. They know this is basically the foundation of their relationship with themselves. So when they put their X's at that time, based on the belief that these 3 elements, the sun, the water, and the land, they were talking about the equivalent, I want to say, of swearing on the Bible. But even more so than that, this was a physical and mental and emotional connection that they were putting their X on.
I think that was a major shift for our people in our history of interaction with state power, because that kind of zeroing in they did on things like Norman Wells, and then also places like Port Radium, Giant Mine, and Yellowknife. That was a big shift in how our people had to deal with the state and the things that they started to do to us. We never had the same incursion of settler populations that people in the South did. You know, some of these indigenous people in the South, now their entire land is paved over in huge areas of huge cities, right? We never had that, but it was this kind of extractive colonialism model that then became imposed on us. So the incursion was not for the settlement of these European populations. The incursion was so that they could exploit the land and profit from it, predominantly through minerals and hydrocarbons.
You have to remember that in 1921, people lived out on the land. They have to tell the truth because it's a matter of life and death. If you tell your friend, your family, the community, I'm going to be there for the winter and then I'm going to come back at a certain time, you do that. If you don't, you know, people are going to wonder what happened to him. So the importance of giving and keeping your word was fundamental. So when they made the treaty, they gave their word. And I remember one time I talked about, hey, let's not take the money because the government is not respecting the treaties. And I remember one of the elders said, what's wrong with you? We gave our word. We can't break our word. And I'm a colonized person. You treat us that way, we treat you that way. We'll treat you the same way. And the elder said, no, we don't do that. We don't go to their level. They lie, they don't live up to their agreement, but we don't do that. That was a very valuable lesson to me.
But it takes a lot of restraint not to sink to their level.
I like to think of it as the war of attrition, you know, the Crown's attempts to assimilate or obliterate us is still ongoing to me in my mind. And so even today, when we find ourselves probably what might be thought of as a much better position, politically or generally, we are still having to stand up for our rights and title, and we are still having to fight the good fight for future generations because everything's not fixed and everything's not perfect, and we will still have wannabe colonial governments trying to encroach upon our territory and our authority in completely inappropriate and traumatic ways in this day and age, you know, the 21st century.
Song of the people, the land of the people, the will of the people must win. The strong Dene nation, the sons of...
When people like Stephanie and Daniel think about how to confront that war of attrition, they draw inspiration from the political radicals that came out of the late 1960s.
It's also important to really recognize the work that our parents' generation did with the Dene Nation and the Indian Brotherhood of the Northwest Territories, as it was originally known back in those early days. And this was a generation of people who had been abducted from their families and their land to be sent to residential school, but then were able to use that education in the white man's system to push back against the colonialism that our people had been experiencing.
They raised us in a certain way so that as far as our Dene rights and title goes, you know, like we're true believers.
Paul Andrews, one of those radicals.
Materially, we were poor. All of us. I don't think there was any rich Dene in the Northwest Territories. Not that I met them anyways. But I can guarantee you, you will never ever find a happier bunch of people. It seems ironic because when somebody comes in, I'm sure they're saying, boy, these people don't have proper housing, don't have proper water system, they don't have this and they don't have that. You know, but at the same time, they seem to be so happy. So I'm sure we confuse a lot of people that way. And this is in communities where a lot of our people are still uncomfortable. And then you take them out in the bush, they become amazing people. I mean, we're talking about running after animals, knowing exactly the kind of day tomorrow is going to be and the day after by seeing the clouds and the wind and the evening sunset. They know all those kind of stuff. They had it all, you know. And this was before GPS, jet boats. Everything was right here in their heart and in their brain.
But even someone like Paul, who I associate with strong roots and tradition, had to relearn to be Dené after the traumatic break of residential school. He remembers the Berger inquiry, that massive airing of indigenous frustration, as a re-education in the Dene way of life.
The Berger inquiry happened in the early 70s. At that time, I was just a few years out of school. But it is amazing how much loss residential schools accomplished. They knew that they had to get rid of the spirituality to break the strength of the Dene nation, and they almost succeeded. I don't think they totally succeeded, but they almost got us to the point where they have broken our backs and taken away the basis of who we are as a nation. So I had to relearn a lot of things. And during the Berger inquiry was an amazing classroom of learning for me. You see, my concept had become like, yes, you own 1 square mile, a lot of land. And started thinking about that. We started talking about things like land claims. The elders would say, what are you talking about? We can't claim our own land, it's ours. But we started using terms like land claims, and they would correct us.
Here's one speaker at the inquiry, translated into English by the CBC.
Every time the white people come to the north or come to our land and start tearing up the land, I feel as if they're cutting our own flesh. That's the way we feel about our land. It's our flesh.
I still can see some of the elders saying, this land is like my mother. This is not a new concept, but this is the first one I heard in a long time again.
That time when it happened was also sort of a time of like a revitalization of our sovereignty, our authority as treaty people. It was sort of like a time of a recognition of our rights, you know, right across Turtle Island and here in the north as well.
The two things that came out at that time was, one was the government said, you guys gave up the land in the signing of the treaty. And that really, really got the indigenous people, especially the elders, riled up because there was no talk about the land during the treaties. And all of a sudden now they said they got a piece of paper with somebody's X that said we gave up the land. And you're calling us liars, essentially.
They did a lot of work coming out of these terrible circumstances, and they had no resources. No one was getting a medium honorarium. No one had travel funding. Like when my Uncle Frank was first chief, I know he was working out of like a paper bag. They didn't have a band office. He had like a grocery bag of documents. So people weren't getting paid to do this. This was real grassroots organizing.
Paul remembers how the movement relied on a firm foundation, the elders behind him. People who never had their relationship to the land severed by things like residential school or the 60s scoop.
You have to remember late 60s, a lot of very healthy elders still lived on the land, still know way deep inside what it means to be Dene. They still have their relationship with their stories, their songs, their elders. And so we had that kind of support from the communities. The elders were always there, whether I thought I needed them or not, whether I wanted them or not. They were always advising, pushing, prodding, and being very clear with me that you will not take money for land. If we take money, we're going to fight among each other. We don't want to do that. They have always been self-governing. The concept of self-government is not new to them. It was new to me. They have always taken care of themselves. They have always known where their jurisdiction and authority lies, and they've known how to share and how to care for each other. The other thing that I think is really important for me to remember also is that the elders at that time did not talk too much about themselves. It is always the grandchildren, always the children coming after them, all the time. And that's the one thing that really resonates with me, because as I get older and I see some of the young people, I ask myself, I wonder what kind of future will they have?
A lot's changed since the 60s and 70s, but the land is still essential.
I think it's important to understand that we are Indigenous people and we enjoy that. We love to be out on the land, practicing our language and our culture and exercising our sovereignty. Even in the summertime, sometimes have a coworker and we would work on building a lot of on-the-land employment opportunities. We would be in the office, what are we doing creating all these jobs? And here we are still sitting in the office. So we would try to, can we just go fishing out in the bay here with our cordless phones from the office? I think, how far is the range? Let's just go fishing and no one's ever going to know.
But it's an everyday struggle to assert our sovereignty, and Daniel's on the front lines. I asked him what he's working on right now.
I can say one of the biggest concerns right now in Good Hope is Norman Wells. They built a bunch of artificial islands in the big river to pump oil. My understanding is that there's pipelines that run from these islands underneath the river to kind of the main processing infrastructure on the shore, on the mainland. And there's been concerns around that for years, because it is right there 100 miles upriver from us. But now they're talking about shutting down that whole operation, and that process is still ongoing about what are they going to do with all their garbage? What are they going to do with these islands? Are they just going to leave them there? That is a massive concern right now.
The specter of climate change hangs above the whole Operation Morning Light project. Sometimes it feels like the satellite is just a little metaphor for that huge catastrophe.
We don't know what the impacts of climate change are going to be like in the coming decades. It makes it impossible to plan or predict if our water is going to be safe to drink or the fish are going to be safe to eat. We've seen studies there's a Department of Fisheries Ocean study in Fort Good Hope on Losh. And what those scientists found is that the amount of mercury that's accumulating in the Losh was increasing because of warmer water temperatures, even without the amount of mercury in the water itself increasing. So we see that even just a change in climate in terms of the average temperature of the water could increase the contaminants that are getting into our food, right?
There's a lot of fear around climate change and they want you to adapt. And I remember being in a setting with some elders and them saying there's a difference between the word adapt and adjust. One means that you're changing. You are actually changing into something else. And the other means that you remain Dené during times of change. That's the way I like to think about it, is that this isn't the first time. We've been through times of change as a Dené people and probably won't be the last time. And I don't think it's going to be the end of us either.
Can we adjust under the system that exists today?
I also look at the current state of the world and politics, and I see that our rights are always trumped by economic interests on the part of Canada and political interests on the part of Canada. And so I get really concerned that we're not going to have any serious ability under that system to protect our land in the future. One of the things that I've been looking at right now is this new proposal that the government of Canada has to introduce regulations under the Fisheries Act to release treated tar sands tailings into the Athabasca River, which is part of our watershed. And there's something like 1.4 trillion liters, trillion with a T, of tailings that's just been building up because these companies and governments have never seriously done anything to deal with it, right? So that's a massive concern for me. In the Sato land claim, there is a whole chapter on water rights, but my understanding of that chapter is that we as participants underneath that land claim don't have the ability to assert our rights or take people to court unless an action impacts our water and that action is not authorized by law. So when it's literally the government of Canada drafting regulations to authorize the release of treated but still toxic tailings into the watershed, we have no rights under that agreement to stop that. And that's scary to me when I think about all of the potential things that could be happening in the future.
But unlike Paul's early days of activism, there isn't as strong a base of solidarity among the Dene to change the system.
You know, in the old days in the Dene Nation, there was always a sense that we are equal. We are inclusive. We are all part of a nation. No matter where you come from, no matter the size of your community, no matter your education level, you're welcome to sit at the table as an equal here.
This is George Erasmus speaking in the early 70s as president of the Dene Nation.
We're seeking a new relationship with the rest of Canada. We insist that we be able to negotiate all of our rights in one sitting. Political rights, traditional rights, the whole rights of our nation. What we are seeking is recognition of our right to set up the system of government. We want to define a boundary within our traditional homeland. All citizens living in this area will have full rights, whether they are Dene or non-Dene.
But the sense of nationhood has dissolved into infighting that gets us nowhere.
I think one of the saddest days in my life was when Dene Nation fell apart. It was so significant in my life. To this day, I'm still trying to find out how the Dene are going to be able to say to each other, "You're welcome to my house, you're welcome to my land." I believe it's part of colonization. The forces of colonizers have forced us to fight among each other on a regular basis. And while other institutions continue to govern and get bigger and better at what they do.
So where do we go from here? For Stephanie, the future begins in dreams, but not the ones that come at night.
Growing up with the colonizers, you know, they're not too fond of daydreams, but that's me. I love to daydream up our future and actively think about and try to indigenize our future. Sometimes in Indian country, you hear talk about living in two worlds, which there's an argument for why that makes sense. But for me, it's just like, no, there's one world. And let's make it an Indigenous one.
One thing that's really critical is that we need to be self-sufficient again, because we were nations on this land before Canada ever got here, and we were self-sufficient. We had our own economies and our own systems of governance. And I think we need to work really hard to get to a point like that again. And obviously, we're not going to go and be making stone knives and nets out of willow bark and that kind of stuff, right? But I mean, we need to be able to provide the things that we need by ourselves, for ourselves. Right now, we're also dependent on government and government money, and we're dependent on industry and industry money and industry jobs. We don't have an ability to say no, even if we don't like something that's going to be happening on our land. And so if we build up our self-sufficiency, we start to remove that dependency we have on other people to provide for us, and we regain that ability to say no.
Maybe what's needed is a shift in perspective.
Sometimes people come here for employment and they just don't make it, right? Because they're just looking inward into what sort of infrastructure or programs and services or things are available here in the little community. But I am always looking out of the community, that's so beautiful in every direction. And what I'm always praying for and looking for, especially, now that it's getting colder and during the winter, is for the caribou to come back. I'm always imagining them coming over the hill or in the bay, because I was lucky enough to experience that and see that when I first returned home. I'm always sort of daydreaming out on the land.
I think we're at a point right now where on a day-to-day basis, life for a lot of our people is pretty good. People are pretty comfortable. But I also think that our types of political organizing that we do are becoming stagnant.
In dreams, everything is braided together. Scraps of memory, TV shows, and pure fantasy. When I daydream about the future, I braid together everything that's made the Dene beautiful, unique, and strong for thousands of years.
One of the things that I think we as Indigenous people have to look at is really, how did our elders survive? How did they do it? And once you begin to ask that questions, you're going to find out that the resilience, the spirit, you name it all, they had it all. So I believe that we have it all. We have all the resources we need. We just don't have the confidence to deal with it. Shame is very, very powerful. And we, I think, dismiss it. Yes, I was ashamed of my people and my grandparents as being residential schools. And that shame contributes to not speaking the language, not knowing the people that we come from, not being able to understand the relationship that we talked about earlier with the sun, everything else. But on the other side, once you understand a little bit more about the Dene have gone through so much over the years. Guess what? They're still smiling. They're still dancing. They're still playing hand games. They're still singing Dene love songs. They're going out on the land. They're doing all those things that were supposed to have been wiped out, that were supposed to be replaced by a superior society. So we know, for example, that we are resilient people. We know we can take anything. We know that.
Operation Morning Light is a production of Imperative Entertainment and Vespucci and is hosted by me, Dëneze Nakehk'o. I wrote it with Michael LaPointe. For Imperative Entertainment, the executive producer is Jason Hoch. For Vespucci, the executive producers are Daniel Turcan, Johnny Galvin, and Michael LaPointe. The series producer is Aliya Pabani. The story editor is Matt Willis. Thomas Curry is the managing producer. Audio mix and sound design by Alice Boyd. Our closing theme is Siga Dante by Digga Wolf off his album In Me Spirit, and this episode was recorded at his studio, Naka Productions. Masi.